Hi, Rich Hoffman here. You have to talk about it because it's one of the most contentious issues in the world, and that's the difference between Islam and Christianity. The fundamental essence of why the two religions are not reconcilable, even though they share a lot of the same characters in their religious texts. The issue comes down to one that I think has not been properly explored because we haven't yet kind of developed the science to understand it. Yet you get these things through historical legacy without really knowing why the meanings have come down the way they were and what the political intentions were behind those meanings. So in the field of archaeology, just because you don't explore something, just because you don't have a scientific method to get you where you need to go, that doesn't mean that because you lack evidence, because you didn't look for it, or because you don't have a scientific means of achieving the evidence, that doesn't mean that a line of thought should not be explored. You can't sit around waiting for evidence to just drop in your lap. We kind of live in a time now where the expert class, the administrative state types, think that if I don't do it, if I don't see it, if I didn't participate, then it doesn't exist. In order for something to happen, I have to validate my authority to it before it can become tangible merit. The field of archaeology has not been around very long. It's only a century old, really, and it started off pretty rough and tumble by a lot of adventurers and eclectic explorers, and has then been taken over by the administrative state. And I think it's great that archaeologists and scientists and anthropologists do the kind of work that you need done to collect information, but we haven't nearly collected enough information to make substantive points about the human race and where it's going, where it came from, and all the things we need to know about it as far as managing our religious and political affairs. So on the issue of Islam and Christianity, of course, there's other religions, Hindu and Shinto Buddhism in Japan. No matter where you go, you find these threads of thought, but there really comes down to two essential ingredients that put them in conflict with each other, and that is Islam and Christianity. And again, source material being a lot of the same characters, like the Adam and Eve story, but fundamental differences in how they are approached. And ironically, I would say that the answer to that question comes from, I live in Ohio, I'm in Cincinnati, and just to the east is one of the most important archaeological spots in the world, and that's Serpent Mound. And the reverence that was paid towards Serpent Mound, who built them, why they built it, in reverence to a serpent. And of course, if you do all the astrological alignments, you find that the constellation Draco plays a huge part in it. Why Draco and what's going on with all of it, which then comes back to this whole idea that there was a global culture, global in that they traded and had communications and had similar modes of religious experience all over the world more than 10,000 years ago. So we have a line of thought that says, some scientists came along and said, hey, we have a theory about how North America was settled through some sort of diffusion across the Bering Strait, and it was primitive Stone Age people gradually progressed and developed ideas, and gradually we went from huts to houses. And we have a linear progression of human development. So that statement's made, and then all evidence that comes in contrary to that gets ignored, because you have to have overwhelming evidence to support and overcoming the theory. It's kind of like an NFL game. If you don't have enough evidence to overturn the call of the refs, then you don't overturn the call. You have to slow it down, watch it in stop motion, and if you don't have evidence to the contrary of the call made on the field, you don't get to change it, which is kind of preposterous. And that's kind of how it works in science and in the archaeology community. They make an assumption, they find a little thing, and then they make a statement, and you got to have overwhelming evidence to support the contrary statement. So that's why this idea that we have some primitive groups of people running around the world 10,000 years ago, and we had some advanced civilization people running around the world 10,000 years ago. You can go in a lot of places in the world now and find primitive people. I can find primitive people in poor neighborhoods who don't behave the way they should. So the real issue is human society does not progress together. You have first world ideas even today, and you have third world ideas who are not consistent with first world ideas. They have different standards, different priorities, different methods of dealing with things, and it can be quite confusing. So if you're looking at everything as a whole, like the administrative state type people do typically, then you're probably going to miss the point. And the issue is, you had old cultures, you had over 10,000 years of a global society, much of it underwater now. You certainly can see that off the coast of Japan, off the coast of India, all through the Persian Gulf. Cultures that fed what we think of as being the biblical culture. And those cultures tend to revere star worship. They had an obsession with the stars, and most of their concerns globally were appeasement of these gods from these stars that were displayed in all their mythologies. And all that progressed along until we had the idea of Christianity and Yahweh saying, no, don't worship all those stars, worship me. And that's distinctive in the differences in the Quran and the Christian Bible through the Jewish text. So in the Adam and Eve story, of course, the serpent is the villain. The serpent is the one that gets you cast from the garden, from heaven, gets you thrown out of paradise. And then, of course, in the Quran, it's the devil. And the devil is then cross-referenced in various cultures and explanations as being kind of the same thing as the serpent, but they're distinctly different. And the two different approaches using the same characters tells you about one culture clashing with another. Now, if you look carefully, Islam is carefully sort of in the same ballpark as the Arabs, Mesopotamia, the Near East, migrating up against the Hindu cultures. That's why they're always at war, because they have different versions of how to serve the serpent, the global serpents, the old gods, the old culture. And you don't see the truth for it just because they changed some of the names. You don't see the reverence for defending the concept of the serpent until you get to a certain point in history where you had a rebellion against the serpent, which is what Christianity became, which is what Yahweh was affirming. And that's why even to this day, it really goes back to that first book of the Adam and Eve story in the Quran and the Adam and Eve story in the Bible, where the serpent was the one that tricked everybody, which the serpent is the previous global culture that went on for tens of thousands of years, likely, probably predating the Ice Age period. And the reason we don't know much about them is because we're not looking where they were, which is at the previous water levels, sea levels. We ignore the evidence, or we don't go look at the evidence because we don't have the money or the time or the wherewithal to overcome a previous theory that the Earth is only 5,000, 4,000 years old, and everybody in it evolved along a certain line of trajectory, and that Stone Age people came into religion through a certain means, and we're going to defend that theory till the end of time. When the truth is that we had a rebellion against the serpent worship of a global view of things. That's what you see in China. That's what you certainly saw in Japan. These serpents, sea serpents, all these monsters at sea that are serpent-like. These are the previous age of the gods, 10,000 BC and before, that are passed down through oral traditions, and people eventually wrote them down. And anything that did last didn't. The evidence is hard to come by because it's so old, and we have an assumption that prevents us from doing the proper analysis of how old should things be, and the things that do come up that fall in that fossil record that are old, we sort of regard as a mistake, when it truthfully wasn't, and we just assume that we have it all figured out, that this all happened in a very linear way. But what really was going on is the Christian movement came along, the Jewish tradition of writing these things down and telling stories from the point of view of a rebellion from Yahweh against this global order, this council of God idea, where Yahweh took over and dominated all assumptions previously with a rebellion against the snake instead of reverence for it, which you find everywhere. You find it in Native American cultures. You certainly find it in all cultures of prehistory. Prehistory meaning when you can certainly start writing things down, and the Greeks were good at it, and they started preserving records in a way that we think of as ancient, which really, in the context of history, were modern. You don't. It just so happens that their preservation was so good that we have a window to it, and we think that's all it was, when it was just part of something that had long been going on for a very long time. And we're going to eventually figure out that our societies were much older than what we thought they were, and that we've been going through this FICO cycle of constantly reoccurring themes. But the difference this time was that we had a rebellion against that for wherever it came from, or wherever these global communities had this reverence and this very complex mathematics that were wrapped up in our pyramids and mound building cultures all over the world that are all the same. How they acquired all this advanced mathematics is you have a technology obviously that existed that allowed them to move around all these big rocks and stones and build monuments that are bewildering even to modern methods. We're seeing a technology that probably came and was here and was advanced in different ways than we're advanced now. They had different priorities, but they had certainly a different line of worship, and that is a reverence to the stars, and particularly the constellation Draco. Sirius comes up a lot too. But they built all these alignments for whatever reason they were doing it. That was very complicated, and it was global, and it wasn't out regional, and it predates even Mesopotamia. And where's the proof? I'd say the proof, you gotta go diving to where the previous ocean levels were 450 some feet below what they are now. And the previous coastlines, where all the prime real estate was, are now underwater. That's one reason I think it would be great if the United States would make Cuba a state again, because off the northern tip of Cuba is several interesting regions that probably show pyramids and temples that are underwater that were previously above water. The landmass that went from essentially Cuba to the Bahamas to the Yucatan Peninsula all the way into Florida. And the reason why we have stories of the Fountain of Youth being in Florida all traced back to this old mythology that we're still looking for the evidence, because you got to look where the evidence is, not where you want it to be, or don't have the funds or the wherewithal or the political will to find it. You can't just close your eyes and say it doesn't exist. You got to have a tenacious effort to actually go get it, because that's how you prove these things. But as far as understanding why there's a level of hatred between Islam and Christianity that's not reconcilable, it goes down to the worship, how worship occurs. And when Yahweh came along and declared that the serpent was the evil one, that goes contrary to this global worship at the time of all the Mesopotamian deities that were live and active. The serpent was to be revered and worshipped, and you see that even in the mound cultures in the Ohio Valley, specifically at Serpent Mound. The mound there is incredible. It's an incredible reverence that was built on the edge of a crypto explosion. It's a crater that this Serpent Mound was built on the edge of. And they obviously knew about it for millions of years prior. So we have a deep history that has not been properly recorded, needs to be, and until it is, you can't really say you know much of anything. But what we do know is the difference between the Quran and the Bible is that in the Garden of Eden story, the rebellion was against the serpent, whereas in the Quran, it was the devil, and you can make the devil be anything you want it to be. But it certainly wasn't the serpent that caused Eve to eat the apple. And that distinct difference is why those two religions will always be at war with each other, because the fundamental defense is to defend a previous order, even if it's a more modern religion, Islam coming about in 600 AD, where you had the Hindu religion and Christianity coming along 1,000 years prior to that, essentially. And the Bible goes back to quite a long time, 4,000 BC, 2000 BC, when you start dealing with all the stories of the Old Testament that everybody knows so much about. When you consider those are fairly recent additions to conscious thought and human development that came along, and Yahweh's approach to fighting against the serpent was a rebellion against the established order of things that went on for tens of thousands of years. And until we can admit to ourselves that that's what's been happening, that we had such an old culture and that we weren't developed in such a linear fashion, we're going to continue to miss the mark and not understand the level of violence and anger that permeates in the subconscious of people based on the distinct difference in wording in the basic religious texts of the two texts that represent those religions. And it really comes down to the difference between worshiping the serpent and rebelling against the serpent. And in Christianity, it was a rebellion against the serpent, and the devil was associated with the serpent, with evil, and that's how we view it. But prior to the moment that Yahweh cast that rebellion against the serpent, you had a global community that worshiped the serpent and worshiped them with great reverence all over the world, in every corner of it. And it wasn't a Stone Age group of people that were just hunters and gatherers. They were very advanced and had extremely advanced mathematics. And that culture died out and a new one came in, and we see what we have today because the ideas of that culture were superior to what they defeated. And that leads us to the dispute today. Should we continue to worship the global ancient serpent, or should we rebel against the serpent and replace it with this new reverence? And I think the evidence of our cultures and the creation of America is all the evidence you need, because that's been successful in ways that history has never been able to record. It's one thing to sit around and worship the stars and worship and pay reverence with all these temples to all these gods out there. It's quite another to take the creative enterprise of doing it for yourself and take responsibility for your own life, and not to revere all these mysterious forces, but to become the mysterious force for your own culture. And that was the decision that was clearly made in Christianity, in the Jewish faith, and in the context of the Bible, rebelling against the serpent, and why Eve was cast from paradise, and why we had to return to paradise by rebelling against the serpent and becoming self-assertive in our proclamations of the battle between good and evil, and to embrace eternal life for the first time in a way that actually worked and wasn't just appeasing the gods of the stars for our sustenance and way of life, and putting all of our energy into that worship, which proved to be disastrous. There was a rebellion for a reason, and that rebellion has been very prosperous for the human civilization since it was created. And I think there's a lot to be learned there, but to go back to the old and continue to do this worship of the serpent as clearly is part of the dispute with Islam against Christianity, but it's also all the global cultures that worship dragons and serpents and these cultures that have been global for over 10,000 years, probably much longer than that. And the rebellion that occurred just a few thousand years ago with Yahweh rebelling against the idea that the serpent was to be worshipped, we've been much better since. And the battle will continue until we admit that to ourselves. And that's where we stand. Anyway, it's Rich Hoffman here. Share, subscribe, make tomorrow a better day. If you ever read my book, Gunfighter's Guide to Business, I think you'll love it. Anyway, have a good day. See you later.